Hello neighbors, it's Brad here at eTrailer, and today we're taking a look and installing the Roadmaster base plate on a 2022 Ford Maverick. Now there's going to be 5 main components that are going to be required to flat tow your vehicle, and starting on the vehicle side is going to be your base plate. And the base plate is generally attached to the chassis of the vehicle or the structural parts of it to create a nice sturdy mounting point for your tow bar. And so that brings us to the tow bar, which is our second component. That's going to make the connection between the base plate and the hitch of the RV. Now on our base plate here, we also have our safety chain loops, which these are just in secondary protection, just in case of an accidental disconnect. We also have our diode wiring, and that's going to transfer the light signals from the RV, so that way when you have your running lights, brake lights, or turn signals on, it's going to mimic those in the taillights of the vehicle, letting the people behind you know when you are turning or slowing down. Now you also have your breakaway cable, which is part of your supplemental braking system, and that's going to allow the vehicle to slow and stop as the RV slows and stops. Now this is what the base plate is going to look like when it's installed, and Roadmaster's done a really good job of keeping this nice and clean here. It integrates in the grill here, so there is no trimming on the fascia, yet you still have the accessibility to all your flat tow components. I also really like the fact that they've mounted up some poles here to get your 6-pole mounted, as well as having a spot for your breakaway cable. So that's something nice. You don't have to worry about fabricating up a spot for each of these components. Now when you are ready to flat tow your vehicle, and you get it ready for flat tow mode, it's going to be real simple to have your arms attached just with the quick twist. You'll see this design here. It's going to slide through the slot, and as you turn, it's going to lock it in place. You're also going to hear a nice audible click. That pin's going to lock in place, and you have your arm attached. So now you can lower your tow bar arms down, and then attaching your tow bar is simple as well. You can just run the pin through. It's going to line these holes, allowing you to put your pin, which is attached to a wire here, in place, snap down, and you have your arm attached. Now with tow bar in place, we'll just get the rest of our flat tow components installed. And what's really nice too is your safety chain loops are easily accessible. They protrude just enough to where it's an easy hookup, but also they're not really protruding. They're set up very well, making it nice and easy to hook up. Now, all that's left to do is put our vehicle in flat tow mode, and we're ready to hit the road. So we'll go ahead and get our hood raised up here. And that's going to allow us to get to these 10mm bolts here. You can see this is just kind of the shroud, but this is going to start to pull off our front fascia to get our front base plate on. So these are going to be a 10mm. You're going to see 1, 2, 3, 4. We'll go ahead and remove these. Now throughout the entire process, I highly recommend having a way to organize some of your hardware, because you're going to need it for reinstallation, and it's going to make it a lot easier if you have them all. So I just use a old muffin tin to put those in, but you can use a piece of cardboard and stick them in and label them, whatever works best for you. But again, it's going to make it a lot easier. So now on our driver's side fender well, there's going to be some plastic push pins along here, as well as some 7mm screws, and we're going to just be removing these. Now if you are doing this on the ground, you can turn your wheel to the inside, and that way you're going to get a little bit more access to it. I'm lucky enough to have a right angle drill here, or a right angle impact, so that's going to make it a little bit easier, because it does get a little bit tight against the tires. But as far as the plastic push pins, they're pretty simple. There's going to be some grooves, and I'm using a trim panel tool. These are really helpful for the plastic push pins, and that way you can kind of separate them, and I'll show you how to do that right now. So there's going to be a total of 6 on each fender, and you're going to see it starts here. You just kind of work your way down, and the way to get these popped out, there's going to be a slight groove on one side. You're just going to want to wedge in there. If you don't have a trim panel tool, you can use a flathead screwdriver and it should work just as well. But once you kind of get that button popped like that, you can kind of just pull there, and then you can actually wedge underneath here, and that's going to make it easy to get these pulled out. So again, go ahead, remove your plastic push pins and keep them in a safe place. So now there's going to be 3 7mm screws, and that's kind of holding on this little air dam here. We're going to go ahead and get those removed. There's also another plastic clip that's tucked kind of back here, and the instructions don't say that you need to remove that, so we're going to kind of go along with that, but it's possible we may have to take that off later. But for now, we'll go ahead and get our 7mm screws off. So now we have access by being able to pull our fender liner back to 3 10mm screws that are they're attaching the fascia to the fender. They're going to be kind of hard to see here, but I think with a Shortwell 10mm socket and a ratchet, you should be able to get to them. So we'll go ahead and get these removed. Now, I mentioned earlier that plastic push pin. It wasn't in the instructions to remove it, but I think it's going to give us a little bit more clearance to be able to pull that fender liner back, just because it is kind of a tough angle to get to those 10 mils. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that. Now the 10mm, they are kind of tricky to get to, so again, peeling that back, you can actually tuck that fender liner behind the tire to make it a little bit easier. 1/4-inch ratchet with a 10mm socket was really easy to get this further one. I think that's probably your best option, but whatever works best for you. Now once you get those 3 10mm out, we can go ahead and repeat the exact same process of pulling off the liner and getting those bolts on the passenger side. So now we're going to head to the front of our vehicle underneath, and you're going to see where our front fascia bumper here meets up with this underbody panel, and there's going to be T30 Torx bits along here, and there's going to be 2, 2, 2, and 2 for a total of 8. So we'll go ahead and get those removed. So now we're going to get ready to kind of peel back the corners of our fascia to release some of the clips. Now there's going to be more clips before we get the fascia off, but what I'm going to do just for a little precautionary is take a little bit of painter's tape, and I just run this along that seam between the fascia and the front fender here, and more or less this is just going to keep that from rubbing against each other, especially because there are clips and it can scratch the paint. So doing this is going to just give it a little bit of layer of protection to where it can rub on the tape and not scratch our paint. So now we're going to start the process of getting the fascia removed, and we're not going to completely remove it with this step, but what we're going to do is there's going to be a clip that's right in the center here, and then there's 2 pins that kind of align it in. Now it does take a lot of pressure to pop that down, and it is risky on the clip breaking. So a little tip here, the clip, if you kind of reach, it's in this center here, there's going to be 2 tabs that open up. So I'm going to try to take a needle nose pliers and kind of pinch that clip, and hopefully that'll allow us to get that pop through without that clip breaking. So we're going to be pulling down as those alignment pins go up. So again, I'm going to kind of just give a little pressure on that clip to hopefully allow that not to break, and then I'm just going to give a little pressure here, and if it does seem like it's fighting, it's because it is a pretty tight fit here, but once we're kind of at this point, you can see that gap. I'm just going to pull straight down, and I'm actually able to see this clip over here, and so we might be able to get this pinched. Again, it does take a little bit of force here. And again, I'm going to try to work on getting this clipped to where it's not going to snap. I can see the tabs here, so with this gap, I'm going to just kind of reach in, pinch it, and then just continue to give it pressure, and we should have this pop down pretty easily. There we go. So that's part of that clip, and just like that. So you can see that clip here. This is where I was pinching, and these are just the alignment tabs. So now that we have this pulled down, we're going to go ahead and do the same process on the other side, and then I'll meet you back up at the engine bay. Now there's going to be clips right here, and you'll see they attach kind of into this radiator shroud, and so what I'm going to do is just put a little bit of pressure here on the tab, and that's going to allow this to slide out. So this kind of clips in there, so just kind of pulling back, and I'll just push on that clip just a little bit just to get it to slide and put it in a position like that to where it's unlocked, and we'll go ahead and do the same on the other side. So that's just popped where we need it to be. And then our next step is going to be getting the bezel around the headlights. So this trim piece here, as you can see, is one piece, and it's actually separate from the headlights. So in order to get this removed, there's going to be 3 clips. Now you're going to want to be careful here. You don't want this to crack, obviously. And I think our best method here is going to be to kind of just reach in this little pocket, and that way you can get a little bit of pressure on it. And sometimes the trick is just kind of working it back and forth a little bit just to get that first clip. But again, just kind of be careful here. You don't want that clip to break. There we go. So it's kind of just using some leverage here. I was able to pop that. And so there's one clip that's right here. There's also two more. So I'm going to just slowly kind of work this out, making sure that we're not breaking our bezel. And then once we have those three clips, there we go. You can see them now. So there's 1, 2, and then 3. So you can kind of see where to put the pressure. So once we get this separated, we'll go ahead and do the same on the other side. So kind of through that process, this did pop back in. So just make sure those are in a state where they're not clipped in. And really the fascia is going to be ready to come off. So you want to grab an extra set of hands here. It's going to make it a little bit easier to get this off. Kind of just work your way from the outside towards the middle, and then you can pull this off. But there is going to be a clip that's going to be on the passenger side that we're going to have to separate before taking the whole fascia off. And I also recommend having a spot laid out that you can put your fascia. That way it's not getting damaged while off the vehicle. So we'll just kind of work our way here, kind of just making sure that we have all of our plastic clips separating. And it might take a little bit of wiggling back and forth here to kind of get this to pop off, but this, you can see it actually slid out. So with a little bit of extra force, you'll see that's where we want that to release. There we go. So now with those all released, again, I said there's a clip here, and if you look down, you'll see this wire attached on the passenger side. So we're going to want to separate that. There should be a push pin or a tab that we're going to push in to get this separated, and it looks like it's on the side with the wires. You can see on the clip here, there's wires on one side, the side without the wires. That's where your clip's going to be. You're just going to push that in, and that'll separate it. So now we can set our fascia aside. Now, depending on your trim level, you may have the passenger alert device, and that's going to be this little fella here. And this is going to be an 8mm screw that we're going to go ahead and remove. And this should be able to come loose here. Now, there is going to be a plug. We're going to actually unplug this. And this actually has a little tab here that goes into that circle, so just kind of lift that back. Now, there's not a whole lot of wiring here, but you can see this clip that goes into it. I'm just going to push down on this tab and get this separated. Now, we'll set this aside and we'll reinstall it later, so make sure you keep your hardware with it. So now we're going to need to remove this shroud that goes around these active vents for our radiator. And there's going to be a plastic push pin on each side. So we're going to start first by getting those taken out. Now with those removed, there's still going to be some clips that you can see here. And pretty much the way that we're going to get these out, you can use a trim panel tool or a flathead. You're going to want to, on the top ones here, you're going to push up towards the top of the vehicle. And the ones down here, you're going to be pushing down. So they're kind of hard to see, but you can see there's a little tab here. You can actually access it here. So if you push that down, you can pull this out. So we'll go ahead and get all those removed, and then we can set this aside for later. So now we're going to be doing a little bit of cutting here, and I'm just going to use a pair of shears. You can use a Dremel or a rotary tool or even an oscillating tool to cut, but right along this little edge here is where we're going to be cutting. So we'll start, just kind of go through here. And it's a thick plastic, but as you can see with shears, I'm able to kind of get through it pretty easily. So we'll just make our way across this. So now that we have that cut, we're just going to slightly pull this out, and there's some tabs here, but that's going to release it from our shutter system. Now we're going to be doing some trimming here on this shutter housing. Before we do that, we're going to want to push these wire tabs in, and they're just holding the wiring here, and we don't obviously want to cut through there. So to press these through, just a flathead, you can kind of just give it a quick bump like that, and they should pop through. So you got those two. There's also going to be two over here that will pop through as well. Now we can pull this wire back, and again, this is just going to give us clearance for when we trim in here. Now I've gone ahead and used some painter's tape just to kind of give a visual cue. I've also marked in yellow where we're going to be trimming out, and this is going to give us clearance for our base plate. So this tab over here will get trimmed, as well as this section here. So now you can see why we pulled that wire back. And there's also going to be some engine components that are fairly close. In fact, the radiator's right there. So getting something with you know, not going too deep, like I think a Dremel would work really well here. I have an oscillating tool here just to get some nice clean lines, but we'll be trimming some of this back. I've marked it in yellow to kind of give it a little more of a visual cue as well. So we have this side marked out. There's also this center section here as well as the other side. And this is going to actually take this active shutter system out. So we're going to be trimming along here. The instructions, I followed along as best as possible. So as far as cutting here, there might be maybe a cleaner way, but hopefully once I cut it and I kind of get a better view on it, I'll let you know the best way to do it. But for now, I'm going to start trimming here. Just be careful not to get too far past the plastic here. We just want that to come out, but not make contact with anything else. So I'll go ahead and cut, and I'll show you how it looks. Now I've trimmed out the driver's side. I'm going to go back and sand it down, but just kind of learning what I did from this side, I think it's easiest to cut along here, and it's pretty much anywhere along here is going to be fine because we're going to get these slats out, but having this open to make our cuts going this way is a lot easier than trying to make these small cuts and work our way. So I do suggest this, cutting this portion here, getting those slats out, and then you can work your way over. So it seems like you'll see these little clips here. There's gonna be 2 of them. If you cut on in between this plastic portion and that, I think that's the best way. You'll have to cut down here as well, but this whole center section will come out pretty easily. Now you're also gonna see this plastic and rubber piece here. It just kind of seems like it's part of like an air dam to kind of funnel air to our AC condenser. We can go ahead and remove this as well, and our center section is also gonna be coming out. So we can go ahead and cut those. So I've gone ahead and made our cuts on the passenger, the center, and the driver's side, and this is kind of what it looks like. Now if you're wondering about clearance, you can see this little condenser line here. You have a decent amount of distance, so as long as you're not using a cutting tool that goes too far, you should be all right. That seems to be the main clearance issue. Now there's also those shrouds that we cleared out, and now we're just kind of left with some rough edges here. So I'm going to go back with a burr bit. If you have a file, that's going to work as well, but just to kind of clean up some of these edges, get some of that flashing off, and then we can move along by putting our shroud back up. So grab your shroud that we previously removed, and we're going to snap this back into place, and you can see these tabs here. Those should face up, so just make sure you have the proper orientation. And this is just going to pop back into place, and then we're going to put our plastic push pins back in on each side, and we're going to be trimming this as well. It does look as if our base plate is going to run right about here. So as far as the instructions say, it looks as if we just kind of follow this line here. So we're going to make a cut here. We're also going to be cutting this center section out as well as the other side. So this whole bottom portion is going to actually be coming off, and we're just going to be left with kind of from this cut up and over. So again, I'm going to just follow these lines, make these cuts, and then we'll get this portion removed. So with that out of the way, now I'm going to just go back and get some of our flashing here. I'm just going to use a flat file here, and just to get some of these burrs off. So we've got our cutting done, at least on this portion here. Now it's a good time to actually get our wiring put back. So I'm just going to snake this back in, and you can actually kind of grab it from this side if you have clearance, and we'll just pop those back into place. That way that wire is going to be holding up. So just make sure you have all 4 of these back in place. And now we're going to head over to the driver's side, and we're going to actually start getting our brackets put in place. So you're going to want to grab your driver specific bracket, and you're going to want to refer to the actual manual to really determine which one it is, but you're gonna see here, we have our bolts here that they're gonna line with this, and this is gonna slide up like that. So you're gonna wanna have this arm here facing towards the middle of the truck here, and we're gonna be bolting it up. First, we'll be taking these two 13s that are down here, and then there's also a 15mm nut that's up here as well. So we'll go ahead, get these taken off. So the stud that we took that nut off, we're gonna slide this portion here on there, and then that should align our holes here. So we'll get this one in place first, and then these should align pretty well. So before putting our hardware that we just took off, we're gonna put this all back in place, but we're gonna wanna make sure to use a little bit of red Loctite. And that's just gonna make sure that over time, these don't get loose. So we'll get some Loctite, put on the stud here, and get the nut in place. And we're also gonna put Loctite on our 13mm bolts down there. And then we're gonna just tighten these down. They say to factory spec, and I'm gonna be completely honest, I'm not sure what the factory spec is. You could probably refer to Ford's manual to get those, but on a newer vehicle, sometimes that can be tricky. But just really snugging it down should be enough. Don't over crank it obviously, but make sure that it is snug, and that Loctite's gonna do a good job of holding it in place. Now these bolts here, you're gonna wanna make sure you have the specific hardware, as there's gonna be two bolts in the kit that look very similar, but one's gonna be shorter than the other. You're gonna wanna use the shorter one because later on we're gonna need the longer ones for bolting into here. So just make sure you use the proper hardware. So now we see that we have this hole on the bracket that's kind of extending back, and we have these nut plates here that are attached to a rod, and this is going to create threads for our bolt to pass in. So you're going to want a lock wash or a split washer here on the bolt, and what we're going to do here is kind of just feed it as far back as possible in that gap, and you might have to give it a little force, but it should slide in like that. And you can put a bend on it, so you can kind of bend it like this, and that's going to kind of help align it to that hole to make it a little bit easier. And then before putting our bolt in, we'll go ahead, just put a little bit of Loctite on there, and then just align those threads. You can see through there, and just kind of get your bolt started here. Sometimes it is tricky to kind of get it all aligned, but with a little patience here, we'll get this threaded in. Now, I've tried to pass up our bolt through here. There's just a tiny little bit of some factory metal there that's causing it to bind up. So I'm gonna just go back with my burr bit here and just grind out just enough to get that bolt to be able to pass through. Now this is going to be a 3/4 inch socket, so I'm going to go ahead and tighten this down, and then we're going to come back with our torque wrench and torque it to spec. Now once you've kind of tightened that down to get some of those threads started, we can go back with our torque wrench, and just using the instruction manual torque specifications, we dialed in our torque wrench and we can get this torque to spec. Now this is going to be an important step. It's going to make sure that there's not too much stress on the threads, but also that it's tight enough, not going to become loose over time. And if you need a torque wrench, we actually have them here available at eTrailer, or generally you can go to an auto parts store and rent them as well. So now that that's torqued to spec, this little rod here, you can generally wiggle this back and forth and it should snap off on that small little weld. And just like that, we have this side torqued down. So we'll go ahead and we're gonna repeat the exact same process that we did on all of our hardware, but with the other bracket. So now we're gonna reinstall our pedestrian alert device. And what we need to do first is, you're gonna see the little nub, and that kind of was to get this in place to mount up, but we will no longer be using that. So I'm just gonna cut this off with some snips here and just kind of make sure that it's flattened out. I might take my file to that just to make sure that we have it flush. So we'll go ahead and plug it in first. You might have noticed when putting up the driver's side bracket here, this hole, I was kind of curious as to what it was, and now we know why. So this will be our mounting point, our new mounting point I should say, for our pedestrian alert device. And so once plugged in, this is just going to align here. But I've noticed that our wiring here is going to be a little short. So there's a little bracket here, just as we had on our wiring over there. I'm just going to take my flathead, kind of push that in. That's going to give us a little bit more clearance. That way we're not stressing out those wires. I pop that off, and it's giving me just a little bit more clearance here. It does seem like it's going to be still kind of tight here to get this mounted up, but let's see what we can do here. And the instruction manual didn't really specify to get a little bit more slack, but I found that there's going to be another little spot here that has that wire snap in. So I just went ahead and pushed that. There's also going to be one that's right here. So pushing these allowed me to get a little bit more clearance of our wire to where I'm not worried so much that it's going to be stressing that. And basically what we're going to try to do here is just align this hole. So now that we can align this without those wires being stressed, we can go ahead and take our Whiz nut, a flat washer, and our bolt here. And this is just going to feed through, and then we'll just follow it up with our Whiz nut on the back side. Now that Whiz nut should kind of bite into the metal and hold tight as you're tightening, but you may have to get a wrench tucked back here to hold it in place. And this bolt is going to be a 3/8 socket here, so just go ahead. This doesn't have to get cranked down too terribly tight. We just want it secure so it doesn't become loose over time. So now at this point, you might want to grab an extra set of hands to get this in place. Now, the tolerances are pretty tight here, but what I'm going to do is try to work our metal in here, as this plate of the crossbar is going to sit in the inside. And so I'm going to just work my way up, and it does get a little bit tight here. This is also a good time to double check to make sure you have clearances where we've trimmed. And if you need to, you might need to trim just a little bit more. But we're going to go ahead and get this kind of slid in place. You're also going to want to have a bolt ready with the flat washer on it and some Loctite, and that way when we get this aligned we can kind of slide that in, keeping it in place. I'm going to get this in place here, and you can see it's already pretty tight, so I might take a dead blow hammer, kind of knock this in place, and then we can get our hardware in place. Now I've gotten this in place and I've used a dead blow to kind of knock it in a little bit, but as I do that, I do see that we have some clearance. And you know, as I followed the instructions, I thought we were spot on, but sometimes it just needs a little bit more. So not only are we hitting here, but on this side, we're also making some clearance issues as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and trim those up, and then we can get this back in place and mount it up. So I've gone ahead and got it in place. I did have to go back and trim a decent amount, but really, as you're putting it in place, use a dead blow, kind of knock it in, and then if you start to see clearance issues, you can kind of go back and trim that up. So now at this point, you're going to want to take your hardware, and with the flat washer on the head of the bolt side, this is going to pass through. Then we're going to follow it up with a split washer and a nut. Now clearly it is pretty tight here, so we're going to have to kind of maybe work we'll hold the nut in place and just kind of tighten the bolt head. So just take your time here. Even the instructions kind of denote that it is pretty tight, and they're correct. It is a tight fit here. So just take your time, and then we're gonna go ahead and get these all tightened down, and then we'll come back with a torque wrench. But at this point, your best bet sometimes is gonna be to just have them hand tight until you get all the hardware in place. That way it kind of aligns properly. Now with all of our hardware hand tightened in place, we can go back with our torque wrench, and normally I like to torque it down on the nut side. It's a better way to torque your hardware, but we really can't get our torque wrench in here without the use of a crow's foot, and even then our center one's gonna be tricky. So what I'm gonna be doing is just putting my 3/4 inch wrench on the back end here, and we're gonna get this tightened down and all torqued. So you can go ahead and do this to all 6 of the bolts. Now once all your hardware is tightened and torqued to spec, that's really going to do it for the installation of the base plate. Now you will have to put your fascia back up, but if you are doing a flat toe setup, this is actually a great time to leave the fascia off. It's going to make it a lot easier to run all your wiring. If you have an air brake system, running all your lines, pretty much all your connections up front, it's just going to be a lot easier to have that fascia off. So I recommend keeping it off, and we're actually going to come back and I'll show you how to get it all back in place and see how it fits once I have all the rest of my components up.
And that was a look and installation of the Roadmaster base plate for a 2022 Ford Maverick.